The wind off Lake Briar was brisk that morning, rustling through the cattails and nudging my docked boat with soft lapping waves. I was halfway through my first cup of coffee when I spotted it, a laminated sheet, bright orange, tacked to the post beside the cleat where my boat, Freedom, had sat untouched for years. Violation notice, unauthorized watercraft. Remove within 72 hours or face daily fines. It was signed with the all-too-familiar seal of the Briar Glen Homeowners Association. Neat, bureaucratic, condescending. I stared at the paper for a moment, then at the boat. Freedom was a 1958 Chris Craft runabout. Mahogany trim, brass fittings, the kind of boat that stopped time for people who knew how to look. My late wife and I had restored it plank by plank during her recovery. That boat had carried us through some of our hardest years. It was more than a hobby. It was memory made tangible. And now it was a violation. I crumpled the notice in one hand and turned toward the house. I already knew who was behind it. Karen Callister. She'd been president of the HOA for just under a year, and in that time, she'd transformed Briar Glen from a peaceful lakeside community into a suburban, surveillance state. She weaponized the rulebook. If your grass grew more than 2.5 inches high, you got a letter. If your shutters weren't regulation white, you got a warning. If your dog barked past 7 p.m., you risked a hearing. Karen didn't enforce order. She enforced control. I called the HOA office that afternoon. No answer. I sent an email. The reply came 10 minutes later. Per new regulations ratified by the board, all watercraft must be registered and approved by the HOA. Your vessel does not meet compliance standards. You have until Friday to remove it. No name, just a digital signature. Briar Glen HOA Administration. I knew that tone. Cold, dismissive, designed to remind me I was a problem, not a person. I didn't respond. Instead, I walked down to the lake and ran my fingers along Freedom's polished bow. The sun had started to dip, scattering orange across the surface. Like spilled paint, I could almost hear her voice beside me. Emily, laughing as we took that first test run, her scarf trailing behind in the wind. I whispered, "They think they can tell us where we belong." The next morning, another letter arrived. This time, certified. You are officially in violation. Daily fines of $250 will begin immediately. Attached was a grainy photo of my boat, circled in red ink, like it was evidence in a crime. And yet, I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was intrigued. Karen had made a mistake. She assumed the lake belonged to the HOA. She assumed the dock was community property. She assumed I was just another homeowner. She assumed too much. 15 years ago, when the original developers went under during the recession, I made a private deal, one that never made the HOA newsletter. I purchased the lake, all of it, shoreline to shoreline. It wasn't an emotional decision. It was business. I saw the potential. Someday, I thought, it might matter. Now it did. Karen didn't know that. She hadn't looked past her covenants and color-coded spreadsheets. She was playing chess with a man who'd built the board. I stood in my study that night, dusting off him the old deed from the fireproof safe where I kept my most important documents. The paper was crisp, the ink official. Lake Briar, Parcel A, full water and access rights. Signed, notarized, recorded. I smiled. Not because I was excited for a fight, but because I knew exactly how it would end. I wasn't moving the boat, and when the HOA pushed harder, I'd push back with the full weight of the truth. Let them come for freedom. They didn't realize I already owned the water under their feet. By Thursday, they escalated, not with another letter, but with a visit. I was sipping sweet tea on the porch when I spotted them, 3 silhouettes in matching navy polos, marching along the shoreline with the unmistakable swagger of self-importance. Karen Callister led the trio, flanked by her 2 loyal lieutenants, Ted Wexler and Belinda Shaw. They called themselves the Compliance Committee, but the neighborhood had other names for them, less flattering, more accurate. Karen wore oversized sunglasses and carried a clipboard like it was a sheriff's badge. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She stopped 10 feet from my dock, pointed at Freedom, and began taking pictures. Click, click, click. I stood slowly and walked toward the water's edge. Morning, I said, not bothering to hide the edge in my voice. Karen turned without looking up. Good morning, Mr. Cole. Just documenting continued non-compliance for our records. Belinda scribbled something. Ted crossed his arms like a bouncer outside a bar. You didn't return my calls, I said, or respond to my request for a meeting. Karen finally looked at me. Her expression was practiced indifference. There's nothing to discuss. The board voted unanimously to enforce the new lake regulations. All watercraft must be HOA registered. Yours is not. I don't recognize that regulation. She smiled, tight-lipped and superior. Then you're free to challenge it at the next hearing. Until then, the fines stand. As of this morning, you owe $750. I raised an eyebrow. You're serious, Karen? Nodded. Very. Then she turned and started walking away. That was her signature move. Drop a hammer, then leave before you could hand it back. Careful, Karen, I called after her. You're trespassing. She froze, half turned. This is common ground. HOA managed shoreline. I stepped closer, calm but firm. No, this is privately owned land. I bought it from the original developers in 2006. She blinked. You're mistaken, she said. But the certainty had cracked. I'm not. Karen didn't reply. She just turned and left, but her pace had quickened, and the clipboard was no longer swinging. It was clutched like a shield. That night, I pulled the old parcel map from my filing cabinet and spread it across the kitchen table. The boundaries were clear. The lake, the shoreline, the narrow strip behind every lakefront property. They all belonged to me. When the development stalled during the recession, the HOA assumed control of the community, but they never thought to check the deed records. They didn't even know what they didn't own. I didn't want to embarrass anyone. I didn't want to fight, but Karen had drawn the line, and I had no intention of stepping back. By Friday morning, the fines climbed to $1,000. I received a formal notice by courier, printed on heavy paper with embossed lettering, like an invitation to a wedding. I never asked to attend. That afternoon, I drove to the county recorder's office and requested certified copies of the deed, title transfer, and tax history for Parcel A, Lake Briar, and its surrounding easement. The clerk, an older gentleman named Walter, raised his eyebrows as he printed the documents. Haven't had someone pull these files in years, he said. You finally gonna put in that boat ramp you applied for back in 2010? Not yet, I replied, but I might start charging dock access. Walter chuckled. Can't say I'd blame you. I left with the folder under one arm and a new resolve hardening in my gut. Karen thought this was about a boat. What she didn't understand was this. Freedom wasn't just tied to that dock. It was anchored in everything the HOA forgot to check. That evening, I stood on the shore, watching the lake catch fire under the sinking sun. Neighbors paddled by in canoes. Children laughed from the public beach on the far end, and Freedom swayed, gently, unmoved by the chaos her presence had caused. I'd been quiet too long. It was time to speak. I walked back inside, placed the deed on my desk, and typed a short email to the HOA board, subject, ownership of Lake Briar, formal clarification attached, with the official documents highlighted and annotated. At the end, I wrote, "Please cease and desist all enforcement actions regarding my boat. As legal owner of Lake Briar and its surrounding property, I am within full rights to more freedom where she sits. Any further interference will be treated as harassment and trespassing." I hit send and leaned back in my chair. Now the ball was in their court, and they had no paddle. The email worked faster than I expected. By Saturday morning, I received an urgent invitation to appear before the Briar Glen HOA board. No apology, no acknowledgement of the attached deed, just a note stamped with mandatory in bold, read, "I attended out of courtesy, not obligation." The community centre had been transformed into a courtroom. Karen sat at the head of the table, like a judge preparing to issue sentencing. Ted and Belinda flanked her, both visibly rattled. A few other board members sat in uneasy silence, avoiding my gaze. The folding chairs behind me were filled with curious neighbours, some whispering, others wide-eyed. Word had spread fast. Karen cleared her throat and banged a decorative gavel. "This hearing is to address ongoing non-compliance with HOA lake use regulations," she began. I stood. "Before you go further, I'd like to clarify one detail." She raised an eyebrow. "You'll have your turn, Mr. Cole." "No," I said evenly. "You've already had it." I pulled a thick envelope from my coat and handed it to the nearest board member. "Certified documents, deed to the lake and its shoreline, recorded in 2006, Parcel A." The room went still. Karen didn't take her eyes off me. "Even if that's true, it doesn't override HOA governance. All residents agreed to abide by community standards." "That's the thing," I replied. "I'm not just a resident, I'm the property owner of the entire lake." Ted flipped through the paperwork, frowning deeper with every page. Belinda paled. Another board member, Susan Gray, one of the few who hadn't followed Karen like a shadow, spoke up. "Is this accurate?" "It is," I said, "and I pay the taxes to prove it." Susan turned to Karen. "How was this missed during the regulation updates?" Karen's voice sharpened. "Our understanding was that the HOA retained jurisdiction over shared spaces, including the lake. You assumed." I corrected. "The HOA owns the clubhouse, the trails, and a few picnic tables. The lake was never part of the transfer from the original developer." There it was, laid bare. Karen bristled, but her usual confidence had curdled into something brittle. She wasn't used to being questioned, let alone cornered. She adjusted her papers. "Regardless, the presence of your boat is unsightly and that's not your call," I said firmly. "I'll be happy to listen to any concerns, but I'm not moving freedom. And if any member of this board steps onto my dock again without permission, I'll file trespass charges." Gasps rippled through the audience. Karen sat back, her mouth tight. Then, a slow clap started from the back. I turned to see Marcus Hill, retired Coast Guard, homeowner on the West Bank, and well-liked among the neighbourhood. He stood, still clapping. "About time someone stood up to this nonsense," he said. "I've had 2 violation notices about my kayak rack. My kayak's older than this HOA." A few people laughed. Others joined in with scattered applause. Karen banged her gavel again, cheeks flushed. "This is highly inappropriate." I let the moment settle, then faced the crowd. "I didn't come here to start trouble, but I won't be intimidated in my own home. I've respected this community for years. But when rules become weapons, someone has to speak up." I paused. "And I will." With that, I nodded to Susan, turned and walked out. Past the murmurs, the stares, the quiet nods of approval. Back home, the air felt lighter. The lake shimmered with the calm of early evening. Freedom rocked gently in her spot, untouched and unmoved. I grabbed a cold beer from the fridge, walked to the end of the dock, and sat on the bench I'd built with Emily. For the first time, in days, I let myself breathe, but peace doesn't last long with people like Karen. That night, I received a cease and desist from the HOA's legal counsel, claiming the board would seek eminent community authority over the lake through civil court. It was a bluff, but an expensive one. They wanted a war. Fine. I had maps, deeds, tax rolls, and patience, and unlike them, I knew exactly what I owned. This wasn't just about my boat anymore. This was about drawing a line and holding it. I didn't respond to the HOA's cease and desist. Instead, I filed my own, a formal cease and desist notice, addressed to the Briar Glen Homeowners Association, citing multiple counts of harassment, trespassing, and unlawful interference with private property. I sent it through a real attorney. No boilerplate nonsense. My lawyer, Gail Trevors, was a specialist in land use law with a steel backbone and a courtroom smile that scared bureaucrats. She CC'd every board member. Then I did something else. I put up signs, large polished wooden ones, hand-painted in mince, bold letters. They read, "Private property, Lake Briar. No trespassing without permission for boat dock access. Please contact ownery." Mounted one on every major access point around the shoreline. 7 in total. Within 48 hours, half the neighborhood was buzzing. Some were furious. Others were curious. Most were stunned. But the message was clear. The lake didn't belong to the HOA. It belonged to me. Then came the fireworks. Figuratively and literally, Karen called an emergency board meeting, then sent out a mass HOA bulletin to the community, calling my signage inflammatory and a violation of community harmony. She doubled down, asserting the board's moral authority over shared aesthetics. I posted the bulletin to my own community forum, highlighting it with a simple caption, "Moral authority is not legal authority." It went viral, at least locally. Comments poured in. "I've lived here 12 years. Never knew the HOA didn't own the lake. Karen tried to fine me $50 last month for having a plastic flamingo. I'm Team Freedom now. Hey, Mr. Cole, any chance you're open to allowing fishing licenses again?" That last one stuck with me. So, I leaned in. I created a simple website, lakebriaraccess.com. It included a history of the property, a scan of the OIS, deed, and a contact form where residents could request dock permits or apply to host events directly through me. I even waived the fees for long-time residents who had always played fair. Overnight, I became what the HOA pretended to be, an actual steward of the lake. That's when Karen snapped. She sent a neighborhood-wide email accusing me of privatizing public space and undermining community cohesion. Then, without authorization, she had maintenance staff remove 3 of my signs. Big mistake. I filed a police report for vandalism and theft of private property. I included security camera footage, crystal clear video of Karen directing a crew while holding a latte in one hand and waving her clipboard like a sword in the other. 2 days later, she got a visit from a sheriff's deputy, and just like that, the tone changed. The HOA's lawyer withdrew their threat of civil suit. Belinda resigned from the board. Ted stopped making eye contact when we passed on morning walks. Karen? She tried to weather the storm, but the foundation had cracked. Residents started attending meetings. Real residents, not her inner circle. They asked questions, demanded minutes, challenged policies. Within 6 weeks, Karen stepped down. No press release, no fanfare, just a notice taped to the community bulletin board that read, "Karen Callister is no longer serving on the HOA board. We thank her for her service." The lake never looked more peaceful. That weekend, I hosted a small neighborhood barbecue on the grassy stretch beside my dock. I called it the Freedom Picnic. No formal invites, just word of mouth. Dozens showed up. Kids splashed near the shore. Parents brought potluck dishes. Marcus brought his battered grill and passed out bratwursts with Coast Guard stories. Someone even launched fireworks at dusk. Small, colourful bursts that reflected across the water like celebration. People weren't angry anymore. They were relieved and grateful. Susan Gray came over with a paper plate and a smile. "You did more than defend your boat, Hank. You reminded this place who we are." I nodded. "Just wanted to make sure Freedom had room to float." She grinned. "Well, she does now." Later that night, I stood at the end of the dock alone. The sky was velvet, black, stars scattered like diamonds. Freedom bobbed gently at her post, exactly where she'd always belonged. Owning the lake had never been about power. It was about peace. But peace, like water, only holds its shape if you guard the banks. And I would, because I'd learned something. Through all this, the only thing more dangerous than a petty tyrant is silence in the face of one. And I wasn't staying silent ever again.